Michael Vannen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about the history of the sword Narsil, or Anduril, of course, as it becomes known in the Lord of the Rings. Now, I'm not going to do this totally chronologically because I actually want to start with the Lord of the Rings and then go backwards, partially because what we know mostly is from the Lord of the Rings, and I want to correct some of the misconceptions that we might have from the movies, but also because the more interesting and more really not really sure what happened stuff comes in for the first and second ages. We can have some idea of what happened in those ages, but it's not really ever specifically stated what happens to Narsil, and so that's going to be a little more speculative, so I'm going to save that for last. So with that said, let's get started and start with Elendil and work our way forward. So what we all know about Narsil, of course, is that Elendil wielded the sword in the war against Sauron at the end of the Second Age. We see this in the prologue to Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring, and it's pretty well known just because it's mentioned in the Lord of the Rings, no matter how you go about telling the story. But what the movies get wrong almost immediately is when Elendil faces off against Sauron, he's actually facing off against him with Gil-galad, who is the king of the elves at the time, and they defeat Sauron together but are both killed in the effort, and as a result Elendil falls backward onto Narsil, and that's how it breaks. It doesn't break because Isildur tries to grab it and Sauron then stamps on it and breaks it. That's not how that happens. It's also worth noting, by the way, that in the book it's pretty clearly stated that Narsil is in only 2 pieces. It's not in like 5 or 6 or however many they show it as in the movie, which is good because it would be really hard to reforge all those little pieces back together compared to just 2. Anyway, that's a side note. After that, what happens, and this you don't really get in most of the adaptations, Isildur, when he returns or attempts to return to the northern kingdom of Arnor to take up Elendil's lordship there, he is ambushed by orcs, of course. That's how he loses the ring. But what we don't really see in Peter Jackson's prologue is the fact that his squire, Oktar, takes the shards of Narsil along with some other heirlooms of the house and whatnot. He takes those. He basically runs at Isildur's command to make sure that those items are saved and returns to the Northern Kingdom with that. So that's how it returns to the Northern Kingdom. Now, after a while, the Northern Kingdom is in decay. Eventually, most of the heirlooms of the household of Elendil are turned over to Elrond for safekeeping. And this, of course, is very important by the time you get to Aragorn's time because the Dunedain have basically been in decline for a long time. They don't really have a permanent home. They're kind of wandering. They don't have a good place to store all these heirlooms. So anyway, the heirlooms, including the shards of Narsil, are kept there. Now here again, we get another distinction between the movies and the novel. In Aragorn's time, he is actually carrying the shards of Narsil with him. Some of the heirlooms are still in Elrond's house, such as the Scepter of Enumenos, which is the scepter of the Kingdom of Arnor, but he wears the Ring of Barahir. He carries the shards of Narsil. He's not carrying another sword. And as another distinction, yet again, and I've mentioned this in previous videos, but the sword is reforged before the Fellowship sets out from Rivendell. So from the point that the Fellowship leaves, Aragorn is carrying a reforged Narsil, and he renames it Anduril at that point. So from almost the very beginning of the story, we have Aragorn carrying Anduril, because in the novel he's very much in the mode of, yes, I am going to become king, yes, I am going to fulfill destiny, and yes, I am going to marry Arwen. So I'm going to get into their whole story in another video, but that's those two ideas are kind of related. So in the course of the movie, you don't really ever see Anduril until Elrond brings it to Aragorn close to the end of the trilogy in the third movie. Whereas in the book, he's carrying it around the whole time. And as a result, and I've mentioned this in a different couple of videos as well, I've got scattered references everywhere, but at Lothlorien, Galadriel gives him a sheath for the sword, which she says that any sword drawn from that sheath will not be broken in battle, even if the owner is defeated. It's kind of an Excalibur type concept going there. The other interesting things that happen with the sword, at the gates of Meduseld in Rohan, he pretty much refuses to give up the sword until Gandalf basically talks him into it, and it almost comes to fighting right in front of the Golden Hall, which gets interesting. He basically is asserting his own lordship in a way, but also just the fact that it's like, he says, if this was any other sword, I would be okay with it, but I'm not going to leave it here. And Gandalf basically says, well, a king is going to have his way in his own hall. So eventually he does leave the sword there, but it's kind of an interesting little side story. And then really after that, there's nothing major that happens with it other than at some point, and I believe this is like at the end of the final debate between the captains of Gondor right before they set out to attack the Black Gate of Mordor, he draws it and basically says, I will not sheath it again until basically this is all over. So that's kind of the last really important, if you could call it important, thing that happens with the sword in the Third Age. And of course, beyond that, we don't really know a whole lot. But it's going back to that little episode at Rohan that we find out another little piece of information, which is where the speculative stuff comes in. So let's talk about the First and Second Ages. So when Aragorn is basically refusing to leave his sword at the gates of Meduseld, and then Gandalf finally talks him into it, he tells the door warden that the sword was forged by Telkar in the deeps of time. Now that reference doesn't really mean very much if all you've ever read is The Lord of the Rings, but if you read the Silmarillion, you find out that Telkar is actually a dwarf smith from the dwarven kingdom of Nogrod. Nogrod is in the Blue Mountains, which in The Lord of the Rings is at the very western edge of Middle-earth. It's where the Grey Havens are. But in the Silmarillion, you had an entire extra piece of land out to the west of that, and it was the very eastern edge of the action. So at this point, the dwarves are not yet totally hostile to elves. They don't really have kind of the same ideas as elves, so they're not super friendly, except with the Noldor, who share a lot of the same interests in terms of making and building and that sort of thing. But there's no open hostility between them yet. So when the elves first discover dwarves in the First Age, it's mainly the sons of Feanor who discover them, and that's who they do most of their trading with. And we find out, for example, that in the Beren and Luthien story, one of the sons of Feanor has a knife called Angrist, which Beren ends up taking from him after he tries to kill Beren. He takes the knife from him, and it tells us in the Silmarillion that the knife was made by Telkar. So we know from the Silmarillion that Telkar was around before Beren. We know at least that much. That doesn't tell us a whole lot because there's several hundred years of the First Age before Beren comes along. But it also tells us that he's not, right there at the end. We don't know whether Telkar survived the First Age or anything like that, but given that he was in the Blue Mountains, it's certainly possible, because the Blue Mountains did survive through the First Age and into the Second Age, at least most of the Blue Mountains did. So we know that he forged things in the First Age, and we know that he did it at least before and up to the time possibly of Beren. And incidentally, the knife that he took, Angrist, is the one that he uses to pry the Silmaril out from the crown of Morgoth. So that's interesting. If you want to see more about that, you can actually check out my video on the history of the Silmarils. But the main point here is we know that the sword was forged by Telkar, and we know that Telkar was at least early enough in the First Age to precede the theft of the Silmaril, so presumably the sword was forged before really the end of the First Age. We don't know that for sure. Like I said, it's possible he survived into the Second Age, and therefore he could have forged it in the Second Age, but most likely it seems that he probably would have forged it in the First Age. Now, it makes this interesting, and this is where it gets speculative. If he forged it in the First Age, How does Elendil then come to possess the sword at the end of the Second Age? Because Elendil, of course, is a Númenórean, and Númenor was an island that was basically created for the men who sided with the elves in the war against Morgoth in the First Age. And for several hundred years, about 600 years, Númenóreans never made it back to Middle Earth. It took them that long to really advance their skills with, seamanship and learning how to sail to reach back to Middle Earth. And eventually they, of course, circled basically the entirety of Middle Earth and did a lot more impressive things as mariners, but it took them a while. So one thing we know that they didn't do is somewhere in that 600 years go back to Middle Earth and grab a bunch of stuff. However, there is an interesting reference in the Unfinished Tales to some heirlooms that the Númenóreans had from the First Age, including many different weapons and things like that. So let's take a look at that passage and see what that has to tell us in terms of how the sword might have come into the possession of a family in Númenor. The passage I'm referring to is from a section called A Description of the Island of Númenor. It's in the Unfinished Tales, and in that, the author, Tolkien, is basically describing a lot of different things about Númenor in terms of its geography, its history, its culture, many different aspects of Númenor, not just a physical description. One of the things that he says is that he goes into kind of their different skills and things like that, and he mentions their smithing. And he basically says that they didn't really smith a lot of weapons, but they kept the craft alive, just kind of as a hearkening back to the past, more or less. And very few weapons were forged, although they did still know how to do it. And he also points out that the king and several of the chieftains inherited weapons from their forefathers, and that these were passed down as heirlooms. To that statement, he appends a footnote. And the footnote is where things get interesting. It says in the footnote that there were many other heirlooms as well. There was Tuor's axe, there was the Ring of Barahir, this, that, and the other. Lists several different items. And then it says that the Ring of Barahir was the only one that survived the downfall of Númenor. Now that's important because it implies that Narsil, of course, was not one of those heirlooms. Because if it had been, the implication is it would have been lost in the downfall of Númenor, but we know it wasn't. So the question is, do you interpret the statement to mean heirlooms of the king's house specifically, or heirlooms that are more generally available in any of the houses of Númenor? Because in the context of the footnote, it's actually not clear, because he's specifically referring to heirlooms in the king's house, the Ring of Barahir, and he mentions the fact that the Ring of Barahir only survived because it ended up being passed down through a separate, non-direct line, eventually to Elendil. But the main thing here is it's talking about all these other heirlooms that were lost, and included in that list is actually the sword that the king would have worn himself. So we already know that there's an idea that the king would have had his own sword that was an heirloom from the First Age. In fact, it's the sword, according to the note, of Thingol, who was the king of the elves in Doriath. And that's a pretty big deal by itself, which implies, we've got swords passed down in the king's house. We've got these other items passed down in the king's house. We know one of them passed down through a collateral line down to Elendil, but there's no mention of any weapons, including Narsil, that were passed down in the same way. But that note, as I mentioned, is really talking primarily about the king's house and his heirlooms. So the question is, does the note mean that only the Ring of Barahir of all heirlooms, or specifically of the heirlooms of the king's household? That's not really clear. It does say, of course, like I mentioned in the primary text, that there were other swords and weapons inherited by other chieftains of the Númenóreans, other than the king. So you could interpret the note to mean, well, in a way that allows for the possibility that Narsil was inherited by one of these other chieftains, and it survived as well, Or you could interpret it to mean the Ring of Barahir was it. That was the only thing that survived the downfall of Numenor. That was an heirloom from the First Age. I'm not sure which of those I like better just based on the text alone, but here's where we get into the more speculative stuff. Let's assume for sake of argument that the sword was not one of the heirlooms. That means, as I mentioned earlier, that it could not have been obtained by anybody in Numenor for the first 600 years of its existence, because that's how long it took for their skill at seamanship to get good enough for them to actually sail all the way back to Middle-earth. So, if it wasn't an heirloom from the First or Second Age, then it would have been several hundred years later in their history before they could have gotten it again. Now, there are many different ways that could have happened. It could be that Telkar forged the sword after Beleriand, if he survived into the Second Age, and then at some point in the dealings that the men of Numenor had with the elves who were living under the kingship of Gil-galad, at some point that sword was traded or given as a gift or something like that to one of the houses and then descended that way to Elendil. That's a possibility. Another possibility is it didn't become into Elendil's possession until Elendil actually went to Middle-earth and then Gil-galad gave it to him then. That's also a possibility. There's no real way to pin down for sure that I can think of how this could have happened. There may be some information out there that I haven't run across, but I can't think of anything specific that could nail this down if that's the interpretation we take. Now, the other possibility, if I'm right about the other way you could take it, it being that only the king's heirlooms all perished with Numenor other than the Ring of Barahir, then the other possibility is that sword came to Elendil through, his ancestry as one of the other chieftains of Numenor besides the king's house. But then that raises the question, how would that family have obtained the sword from, in the First Age? So here's where that line of speculation could lead us. We know, for example, that, of course, Telkar was trading weapons with the Sons of Feanor because one of the Sons of Feanor has the knife Angrist. So we know that trading is going on. Another thing it tells us about Telkar is that he is also the person who forged the dragon helm that Hurin, who is the father of Turin Turambar, wore in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. So we know that at least some of the items made by Telkar made their way into the hands of men in the First Age. So it's entirely possible that even though that the Sons of Feanor were the ones doing the primary trading, that they then further traded some of those items to other men or elves who were in the alliance against Morgoth. And the sword Narsil could have been one of those items, and it made its way to one of the men who was fighting alongside the elves, and whoever that man was would have been somebody who survived, past the worst of the battles and everything, made it to the at the end of the First Age. Basically, you have the remnants of the kingdom of Gondolin and the remnants of Doriath basically living a precarious existence at the mouths of the great river Sirion, and that's where Elendil sails from there to try to find Valinor to enlist the aid of the Valar to help elves and men. It could be that one of the fathers of men, had the sword, survived, all of this devastation, and made it somewhere, in that list of survivors, not in Sirion because that was an elvish area, but somewhere where there were still people hiding out or surviving, precariously. And then those men who were then kind of gathered up in the final battle against Morgoth and given the realm of Numenor, one of those men could have had the sword Narsil, and that's how it could have been passed down ultimately to Elendil. Again, it's not clear. There's no way to nail that down. And an alternative, I suppose, is that the sword was actually in the possession of somebody from Gondolin or Doriath, and then it was given to Elros, or not Elros because he's the king, that wouldn't make any sense, but it was given to one of the men who ended up going to Numenor as a gift by one of the elves who was also in the battle. That seems a little less likely. I think it's a little neater if we assume that it was just in the possession of a man from the get-go. So, but that's just, my mind thinking that that's the more neat way to handle that. Either is possible, but I just don't think the other is as likely. Anyway, those are my speculations on how Narsil could have passed from the first age to the end of the second age. If you have any other theories or any other information that would shed light on how it might have happened, I'd love to hear it in the comments. But for me, that's about all I can muster, so we'll leave it there. So, there you have my theorizing and speculation about the sword Narsil, how it made it from the first and second ages all the way down to Elendil and eventually Aragorn. Like I said, if you have any other information or theories, I'd love to hear them in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. Please also subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. And if you also want to, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.